it is good to see you this morning. I didn't know, I thought opening weekend we might, not have, I might be me and Sister Lautaret here as we're just looking at one another, but I'm glad all of you are here. I suppose that means that you've already got your game. Yeah. Okay, well, let's hop in. We're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 16. If you want to look, you can look there, and most of you have it memorized, I'm sure. Anyway, but Jesus had just been spending quite a bit of time up north of the Sea of Galilee in pagan territory. He went up to Tyre and then up to Sidon, even farther north. And then they came clear back on the other side, the far side of the Sea of Galilee, and spent time around Decapolis, the 10 cities, which was called Rome away from Rome. Then they came across the Sea of Galilee, about an 8-mile trip in a rowboat. I mean, a big boat big enough to haul at least 13 people. And we don't know if there were any more than that, but there were at least that many. And so I don't know how fast you can row a boat like that, but it's an 8-mile journey. It's pretty good. On a couple of those journeys, it got pretty rough. They got over on the other side where, in towards Galilee, and the Pharisees immediately got a hold of them and demanded a sign. Now, Jesus had been performing miracle after miracle after miracle, but he got over there and the Pharisees said, give us a sign to show that you really are from God. Well, God doesn't do command performances. He often blesses us in ways that are beyond our comprehension, but we don't, demand God do this, that, or the other thing. And so when they demanded a sign from Jesus, he got his disciples, they got back in the boat and went back across the Sea of Galilee, and they ended up at Bethsaida, which was the home of Peter and Andrew and, somebody else, another one of the disciples. So Mark tells us that Jesus healed a guy there, and that's where a blind man, and that's where we hear about the guy says, Jesus asked him if he could see. He said, yeah, I see men, but they look like trees walking. So he touched him again, healed him, and he was restored. So they went right from Bethsaida north up to Caesarea Philippi. And I think I mentioned last week that when Herod the Great died, just shortly after Jesus' birth, that's why they fled to Egypt, because Herod killed all the babies around the area of Bethlehem. So Joseph was given a message in a dream to take Mary and baby and head south to Egypt. They did. Once Herod died, it was safe to come back. So they came back and went to Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. And so the territory had been divided among Herod's 3 sons. That part around Jerusalem and Judea was given to one of his sons. The north area, about Galilee, was given to another one of his sons. And then Philip, the other son, was given the territory in Caesarea Philippi, which he named after himself in all great humility, Caesar and Philippi, as opposed to Caesarea Maritima. Okay, so now that you've had the geography lesson, you're all up to speed and psyched and all that kind of stuff. When we got up there to this pagan town, there was an two interesting interactions with Peter, and they are just I think like us. 1 minute you're just really spiritual, and the angels are singing, and the choir is all gathered up, and you're Jesus' little sunbeam, right? And then the next little bit, you're lowering a pregnant snake's belly in a wagon rut, and you got a whole different kind of thing going on. So anyway, maybe none of you are that way, but I find myself facing that sometimes. So here we're going to look at the first account, just as kind of a setting the stage for you. Matthew 16, starting verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, who had been killed just recently. Others say Elijah, who died several centuries before that. And still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, all of whom had died a long time ago. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're the hope of Israel. That's what was meant by all those things. You are the Christ. So Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. You have been given a heavenly revelation here, man. You are great. Nice job. Attaboy. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, the powers of death, the gates of hell will not overcome it. Now that's pretty heady stuff. I'm sure secretly he was going like this to John, you know, hit me big boy, you know. He had just really been given some, wow, I mean, what a great thing. You're Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of death and the powers of death, the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. You know, that's good. And then he goes on to say, not only that, but whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and, all those things that people have misunderstood and misconstrued for 2,000 years. He said, still heady stuff. Almost immediately, in fact, it records that we turn right around now, and there's another interaction with Peter, the same guy. That starts in verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem. Now, they're a long ways from Jerusalem. They're like 130 miles or so from Jerusalem, at least walking. And they're up in pagan country, right near a temple to the pagan god of Pan, and another temple there for the worship of Caesar, right there in Caesarea Philippi. So from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Now that is very clear language that Jesus gave to the disciples. We see over and over and over again the disciples still did not get it. They just didn't get it even right up. I don't think they got it up until the resurrection. They probably didn't get it till the day of Pentecost. They just could not, the resurrection was an amazing thing to them. Maybe they began to get it then. But all the way through the remainder of Jesus' ministry, he kept telling them, these things are going to happen, this is happening. But anyway, this was the first shot over the bow, apparently, of that. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. I mean, here, Peter has been with Jesus walking on the water. He himself leaped out of the boat and walked on water for a little ways before he looked at the sea and the waves and all that and started to sink. Jesus had to rescue him, pull him back into the boat. Here he had seen all these miracles, and then he takes Jesus aside and says, Lord, this should never happen. There's got to be a better way. I mean, come on, right? Looking back at it, that takes a lot of gall. You rebuke Jesus. Anyway, he began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what can man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, man, there is a whole gob of stuff in that little passage, and I'm not going to preach on all of that for the next couple hours, but I'll do my best to hit a couple things. The first thing I want you to notice is that Jesus was speaking very plainly to the disciples. Mark says very clearly in the same passage, he spoke plainly about this. Was not a veiled reference. He tell them, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to have to be abused by all the religious leaders there. I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to come back to life. Why did they not get it? A couple things come to my mind. I guess one thing is they probably thought it is impossible to hurt Jesus. I mean, how are you going to hurt a guy that can do all this stuff? How are you going to hurt a guy that can raise people from the dead? How are you going to hurt somebody that can feed 5,000 with a sack lunch? How are you going to hurt, so, they must have just thought, that's impossible. Jesus can do anything. No way is this going to happen to you. Maybe it was because they thought, because Jesus was profoundly popular. I mean, everywhere he went, there were multitudes of people that came. Any traveling evangelist would be thrilled to have that kind of crowds, TV or not. It was, everywhere Jesus went, he healed people. He was phenomenally popular. You ever been in a situation when it seemed like, wow, we really, we can't lose now, we've got this thing handled. And then all of a sudden the tide turns. Well, they probably thought, no, he's so popular, this can never happen. Maybe it was just straight denial. Like the disciples, we need to learn that denial is more than just a river in Egypt. But one of the things is that Peter had a better idea. Now, never, Lord, shall this happen to you. Folks, we look at Peter and we say, how could you be such a dipstick? You had just been given this wonderful revelation, and now here you are rebuking Jesus. But let me ask you this. How many of us have a better idea than Jesus pretty regularly? Any of you ever had that experience? You know what is right. We know what we should do. We know the way it's supposed to be. But we got a better idea, and so we know that whatever it is that we think, and so, whether in our dating life or whether in our business life or whatever it is, we have a better idea than Jesus. Man, that's why we need grace. So we can't blame Peter too bad. So Jesus rebuked Peter as an adversary. See, Jesus was concerned about his kingdom. Peter was concerned about things of this world. Now, there is no question but you and I are tempted daily to be concerned about the things of this world. And it's, some of that is fine. We're given the creation mandate to take dominion over the world. Nothing wrong with trying to take care of business properly. Nothing wrong with living here. We live here. We're not supposed to be so heavenly minded we're no earthly good, but we're supposed to have first and foremost the ideas of the kingdom involved. Jesus had that. He came to die. He came to provide the sacrifice so that all mankind could live if they will. He came to provide a choice to what the world and the enemy has to offer. But Peter was focused on this world. Peter was bringing a temptation to Jesus. That's why Jesus said to him, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter was carrying the water for the world and the flesh and the devil. See, when Jesus was tempted, we can read that in about 30 seconds, and it sounds like, oh yeah, Jesus was hungry, he'd been fasting for 40 days, he goes out in the mountains, and man, he sees all these rocks that look like loaves of bread, and so he's tempted to turn them into bread because he's fasted for 40 days. Nothing wrong with wanting to eat, that was not the plan. He was tempted in that regard. And then we see that he was tempted, taken up on the high part of the temple and said, jump off of here and impress folks. He was tempted to advance the kingdom by impressing folks. Look, God can do that. The God that can put a rainbow in the sky can do anything that he wants to do. I mean, he could write the gospel message in the clouds. He could tap us all on the shoulder and speak to us person to person. God has unlimited capabilities. Jesus was tempted to bring about his kingdom by stunning folks into submission. And then he was tempted, by Satan to look at all this stuff and say, if you just worship me, all this will be yours. Now here, we read that very quickly and think, big deal. But the Bible tells us that Jesus was tempted in every single way like we are. you know, even today, my concept of Jesus is a nicely coiffed hippie floating about in a white robe about this far off the ground. No wonder he can walk on water, because he hardly ever touches the ground. Do you have a similar image? You know, we think of Jesus, we think of this, you know, just this wonderful being. He certainly was a wonderful being, the only one ever came to pass. But the Bible says he was tempted like we are. Now, I've been tempted in some pretty grungy fashions. Have you? Anybody ever give in to some of those? Yes, I see that very timid hand there. Yes, yes. Are there others? Yeah. Okay, so Jesus was tempted in all ways, and Peter was tempting him by suggesting there's an alternative way. How often have we, somebody comes to us, for example, say, you know, I feel like God has called me to the mission field or whatever. You don't have to do that. You can serve God right here. Or whatever it is, how often have we been an impediment to somebody trying to follow God? Or how many impediments do we have in our world? That we feel like and we believe that God is calling us into a particular thing, and somebody says, you don't have to do that. Things are going well here. Just relax and, you know, do whatever you're doing. Well, it was the kind of temptation that Peter was suggesting to Jesus. There's another way. That's why Jesus said to him, get behind me, Satan. So in one sentence he says, you're Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of death, the powers of Hades are not going to be able to overcome it. And they haven't. Every generation up to today has died. Every generation, every person of every generation has died. But the church has moved right on. It gets passed on from person to person to person, just like we're doing here, and this is happening in thousands and thousands of places around the world, some fancy and some a lot less fancy. But the church has overcome all those things. But Peter was being an adversary. Right after Jesus said to him this great, wonderful thing, he comes right around and says, get behind me, Satan. That's one of the hazards of trying to understand that Peter himself, as the man, was the rock upon which God was going to build the whole church. Yeah, the apostles and prophets were built into the foundation, and we're all a part of that. We're living stones built into it. But Peter, as a person, was not the rock upon which the entire church was to be built. Jesus said to him, you're Petros, a small pebble, or part of a rock, a piece of a rock, on this Petra, the solid rock of your confession. Or maybe he was even pointing to himself, on me, the solid rock, because Christ is the solid rock. But whatever it was not just intended, in my estimation, to be Peter as a man. Then, as we move on to this, I want to look at another piece that comes. He says, Jesus gives us his part of the law. You know, a lot of people today say, well, we're not under law at all, we're under grace. That's partially true. See, the old covenant with the nation of Israel has been superseded by the new covenant. The law of Moses has been superseded now by the law of Jesus. The law of Moses was, thou shalt not kill. The law of Jesus is, thou shalt not even want to kill. The law of Moses was, don't commit adultery. The law of Jesus is, don't even think about it. But there is a law with Jesus. And this, what he starts to say here, is a piece of the law, but you chew on this baby, and it keeps growing as you chew. So here, when he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now this was way before the cross that Jesus was crucified on ever came about. So this is the first time the disciples really have heard about Jesus going to Jerusalem and going to the cross. It was the opening salvo, but he's still talking about that. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Let me ask you this. What will a man give in exchange for a soul? Let me ask you a question just to kind of give a perspective here. If you're out wandering around in the ocean up to your waist, and somebody comes along and grabs you and holds you under and says, I'll let you up if you give me your vehicle, would you go for that bargain? I would. Are you kidding? I mean, what would you give in exchange for your soul? You know, if you're underwater and you can't breathe, and somebody says, give me the title to your house and I'll let you up. And if you knew that that was a credible thing, would you give them the title to your house, or would you just go ahead and die? I would wager that there's not a person here but what would say, anything I've got in this world, anything I've got, it's yours if I can live. That's just to stay alive physically. We're all going to stand before God. We are going to stand before God. I mean, that's not a close call, at least according to the Scripture. Now, what will we give in exchange for our soul? That's the question that Jesus posed to his disciples, and I believe he poses to us. And what he's saying is, prepare ahead of time for that, because it's coming. I'm telling you it's coming. And now you have a decision to make. So the first part of that is, if any man would follow me. That word if is, I think, very significant. Because it says that anyone may come, and also that anyone can come. Not only are you given permission to come to Jesus, but it's within your power to come to Jesus, because the powers of death and hell have already been defeated at that point. Nobody can keep you from coming to Jesus. He has made that way available. The only thing standing in the way of anybody coming to Jesus is pride, potentially ignorance, but I believe God is smart enough to deal with the ignorant part. You know, always one of the heathen always want to say, well, what about the poor guy in the jungle that never heard about Jesus? Is God going to just send him to hell because he never heard? I don't think so, and I think Romans deals with that. You know, the point is that God is able to keep score. He knows those are his. But no person can be kept away from Jesus if they want to come to Jesus. That's a matter of a choice. It's a matter of decision. It's a matter of the heart. Or do we really want to please God, or do we want to do our own thing? Now look, that's the law part of the gospel that says if you're going to follow me, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. Because if you try to save your own life, you're going to lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. So in this whole thing of coming to Christ, baptism is a picture of that whole thing. So when we're baptized, we are dead with Christ, and then we're raised to new life with Christ. We're identifying with Christ. We're washed from our sin. We are experiencing the resurrection, just like as we are symbolically buried with Christ, we're symbolically risen with Christ. Not only are we a new person now, but we have the promise of God that we can live forever. So the whole picture of baptism is about the newness of life that happens in Christ. Now the law side of the gospel says you've got to live a perfect life. So if you want to know how to get to heaven, there's really two ways to get to heaven. One of them is to live a perfect life. Now, if you've done that up to this point, don't screw it up. But if you're smart enough to realize that you haven't done it, the other way to get there is by acknowledging that we haven't lived perfectly calling upon the Lord and receiving His mercy, His forgiveness, His grace. So we're not under the law from the standpoint of the Old Covenant law. We are under the law of Jesus. If anybody would follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Because if you're going to try to save your own life, you're going to lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. The beauty of that is that the law demands perfection. Even the law of Jesus demands perfection. It even demands perfection in thought, not just deed. The grace of God comes in for all who will recognize their need and their lack and call upon the Lord. That is a phenomenal picture to me of the law of Jesus and the grace. See, many, when they heard Jesus' hard sayings, stopped following him. And Jesus has some hard sayings. Man, this, what he's saying here is radical. It's way radical. It is beyond radical. There's no way we can measure up to it. Jesus puts the Grand Canyon out there and says, okay, jump it. Now, if you happen to fall a teensy short of jumping it, I happen to have grace to pick you up, but you got to have sense enough to call upon me to pick you up. And I will do that by your own humility and acknowledgement of sin. See, one of the challenges with our culture today is that our culture is eradicating the idea of sin. Nobody's guilty of anything. We're all just sick. We have a disease. If you're a stumble-down drunk 3 times a week, that's all right, you just have a disease. If you're a serial adulterer, hey, that's okay, you just got an addiction. You got a sexual addiction. I mean, what can you do about it? Nothing. It's just that's the way you're created. And on it is with everything else. So sin is just eradicated with the idea that nobody's guilty. Jesus comes along and says, everybody's guilty. You're guilty. You're guilty. You're guilty. You're guilty. I'm guilty. And if I have to stand before God and defend myself, I am in deep, deep, deep weeds. But Jesus says, if you'll come to me, all you who are heavy laden, under a burden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke on you. You want to save your life? Do your own thing. Do it your way? Fine. You're free to do that. But I'm telling you, going in, you're going to screw it up and you're going to lose. You're going to lose your life. If you're willing to lose your life, be buried with me and identified with Christ, be clothed with Christ, which is another picture of baptism, then I'll save you and I'll deliver you and I'll keep you now and I'll keep you forever on that basis. So does that make sense so far or not? Are you picking up the issue of the law and grace? Because there's so much of the idea today, even in Christian circles, that I can live any way that I want to and it's perfectly fine. And so we don't even recognize that we've got to call upon the Lord, that we have to confess. It's just that we're living as though there is no law, as opposed to living with the clear idea that there is a law that no one can keep. But God's grace is there for those that acknowledge it and call upon the Lord and are saved. There is 2 little proverbs kind of in closing that I think really typifies this. And in Proverbs 12:15, it says this: the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. Now you got to listen to the right advice, because the wrong advice is not all that helpful. If you're listening to the advice of the world, not a good idea. But folks, look, think about that for just a second. If you're buying a car, or buying a horse, or if you're buying whatever it is that you're buying that you're going to have to rely on, there's a way that seems right to a fool. Let's get an imitation Swiss Army knife. You can buy them for $1.95, you know, okay? But if you ever have to use the thing, it's useless. So a wise man gets the counsel of what is it that I need. And a wise man is always looking for those in whatever field of endeavor that have more experience than them, or even to trade experience with other people, because a wise man says, if I know what I know, and I know what you know, that's an advantage to me. The fool already has it not. He's already got it set up. He knows everything. A fool is, smarter than 7 wise men. It's exactly the same difference. Do we have the humility to learn from God and realize from the law, or are we going to do it ourselves and have a better idea than Jesus? The other proverb, and it actually shows up in a couple places, but in chapter 14, verse 12, says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. What will a man give in exchange for a soul? In that moment of time, a person will give anything. But the way God seems, from the way I can understand Scripture, that God has given us an opportunity as humankind. He's given us, each of us individually, an opportunity to respond to Him. And we don't have to respond by killing animals. We don't have to respond by doing all these other things. But we do have to respond by having the humility to call upon the Lord and allow His grace to cover us, so that we become clothed with Christ. So that as God sees us, He doesn't see all of our guilt and shame and filth and whatever, but He's able to see Christ in us. We get the innocence of Jesus because Jesus took the guilt of us. Man, that is a bargain in anybody's world. You know, daily I see folks making decisions, and I've made my share of them myself, that this is not going to end well. It just can't end well. There's a way that seems right. Peter was telling Jesus that there's a lot better way, Jesus. You don't have to die. You really don't have to do that. This should never happen to you. Let me give you some counsel, God. Let me tell you how things ought to be. Now, I've got some ideas about how the world and the universe should be run. If my ideas were implemented, we would be in a lot of trouble very rapidly, I'm sure. God has put things in motion, has made provision for every person, and man, I for one am awfully glad. Hallelujah. The law is still there, it's just a higher law. And it is impossible law, and that's where grace comes in to carry us. Amen. All right, anybody have a word of thought or something that comes to mind that out of this is that?
I was just struck how God turns all things to good, doesn't He? I mean, even in Peter's, that whole point there, I mean, wow, what an amazing teaching point that we have to be able to just reflect on that. God does turn all things to good.
Yeah. Another thought that I had put down and neglected to get to, but was Peter. When a lot of people heard the hard sayings of Jesus, they bailed. B-A-A-L-E-D, some of them, and B-A-I-L-E-D, others of them, but they quit following anyway. See, Peter didn't do that. He received the rebuke. We don't know what all else happened there, but man, he had to be chagrined. Here we just told this wonderful thing, and then he's told, get behind me, Satan. Well, that's all we see, but they had miles to go before the rest of it went on. But as Peter responded that way, he kept following and kept following and kept following. And even though he denied that he knew Jesus at the crucifixion, when he saw Jesus again, he came back repented, was forgiven, and went on with his life. He never became perfect. He never became the first infallible pope. You know, I mean, Paul rebuked him later on in life. But even in his death, when he was ready to be, he was going to be crucified, as ancient church legend and tradition has it. He was going to be crucified, and he opted to be crucified upside down because he was not even worthy to be crucified in the same fashion that Jesus was. So he laid down his life and found life. I thought it just, how he stayed with it. So that was a good thing. God is able to take, even all the times that we need to be rebuked, God will take that and work it into our story, into our lives, if we just keep following, keep trusting.
Thank you for listening. For questions on today's message, please reach out to us at www.flatheadekklesia.org.